Arthur Dent woke up to a sound so dissonant, so bone-deep and wrong, that he immediately suspected it had come from inside his skull. It was not his alarm clock, nor the neighbor's hideous dog, nor the pipes in the walls, which had a habit of screaming like dying banshees on foggy mornings. No, this was something altogether other. The sound, a low droning hum that seemed to vibrate in ways the universe should not allow, came again. Arthur sat up, heart rattling in his chest, and glanced toward the window. The sky outside had turned the sickly, bilious green of a bruise on rotting flesh. "What fresh hell is this?" Arthur muttered, swinging his legs off the bed. His slippers were missing. Not just misplaced, gone. The carpet under his feet felt like it was breathing. Arthur, a man whose life revolved around routine, and more importantly, his deeply ingrained denial of anything remotely extraordinary, decided to ignore the oddities and shuffled downstairs to put the kettle on. He would make sense of everything. It always did. The droning hum followed him, growing louder. He thought it was coming from inside his skull, a grim orchestra of bees playing a symphony of dread. It was only when the kettle boiled with an unearthly scream, spitting out not steam but a dense, ink-black fog, that Arthur began to suspect something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. The house shook violently. A fissure split the kitchen tiles, and through it oozed something wet and glistening, something that smelled faintly of burning metal and despair. Arthur stepped back, clutching his chipped teacup as though it were a weapon. "No," he said firmly. "Not today." The doorbell rang, the chime warbling like a dying theremin. Arthur flinched, his teacup clattering to the floor. Standing on the porch, clad in what appeared to be a bathrobe stitched from the skins of unrecognizable creatures, was Ford Prefect. His smile stretched too wide, and his eyes glimmered like trapped stars, both beautiful and terrifying. "Arthur, old friend." Ford's voice was a little too loud, his tone carrying the manic cheerfulness of a man dangling over the edge of an abyss. Arthur stared at him. "Ford, what are you wearing?" "This?" Ford glanced down at himself and shrugged. "Found it on an abandoned moon. Surprisingly comfortable. Speaking of moons, well, planets, actually, did you know Earth is scheduled for demolition in about—" He checked a grotesque, pulsing device on his wrist. "Oh, 2 minutes." Arthur blinked slowly. "Demolition," he repeated. "Yes," Ford said, stepping inside uninvited. "Some bureaucratic nonsense about needing hyperspace clearance. Don't take it personally, they're clearing half the galaxy for a bypass." He sniffed the air and wrinkled his nose. "Is that existential horror I smell?" Arthur was about to retort when the droning hum crescendoed. The walls rippled like water, and the fissure in the floor belched up a spindly appendage covered in chitinous barbs. Ford gave it a passing glance. "Ah, Vogon advance notice. Don't look it in the eye. It tends to stare into your soul and rearrange things." "What?" Arthur shrieked, backing against the wall. Before Ford could elaborate, the fissure widened, and the entire kitchen collapsed into darkness. Arthur screamed as he was pulled into the void, the world spinning into chaos. Arthur awoke to a cacophony of sounds, distant screams, guttural whispers, and the wet squelch of something moving just out of sight. He was lying on a cold, metallic surface in what appeared to be a corridor lined with faintly glowing, pulsating walls. Ford stood over him, holding a bottle of something that smelled like gasoline and regret. "Drink this," Ford said, thrusting the bottle at him. Arthur recoiled. "What is it?" "Safety protocol. Also, it might kill you, but not drinking it will definitely kill you." Against his better judgment, Arthur took a sip. The liquid burned down his throat, and for a moment, he felt his consciousness expand, his mind brushing against the edges of infinity. He saw stars being born and dying, galaxies twisting in impossible geometries, and the faint outline of something vast and malevolent lurking in the void. Then he was back in his body, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" he wheezed. "Perspective," Ford said, grinning. "Now, welcome aboard the Vortex's grin. Don't mind the decor. It's a bit organic." Arthur sat up, his head spinning. The corridor walls seemed to breathe, and the faint glow came from veins of bioluminescent fluid coursing through them. Where are we? A ship. Of sorts, Ford said. Stolen. Naturally. Lovely little biomechanical beast. She's moody, but she gets the job done. Now, let's find the guide before the Vogons catch up. Arthur stared at him. The guide? What guide? Ford's grin widened. Why, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Abyss, of course. The most comprehensive and deeply unsettling compendium of all things utterly incomprehensible. Arthur opened his mouth to protest, but a shadow fell over them. A towering figure loomed at the end of the corridor, its form shifting and writhing as though it were made of liquid darkness. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, glowed with an unholy light. Ford's expression darkened. Ah, that's new. What is it? Arthur whispered, trembling. Ford clapped a hand on his shoulder. That, my friend, is what happens when you leave a dimensional rift open too long. Run. Arthur ran. His mind screamed at the sheer impossibility of it all, but his feet obeyed the primal urge to flee. The shadow thing pursued, its liquid form surging forward in great, undulating waves. The walls of the corridor pulsed faster, their sickly light intensifying as though they were reacting to the presence of the creature. Ford sprinted ahead of him, laughing, or perhaps screaming, his voice lost in the cacophony. This way, Arthur. Quick, before it decides to digest us. What does that even mean? Arthur yelled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It means it's sentient, angry, and hungry. Pick up the pace. The corridor twisted violently, the floor tilting as though the ship, or whatever this abomination was, had a mind of its own. Arthur slipped, his hands slapping against the fleshy wall, which quivered under his touch. He gagged as something warm and slimy oozed over his fingers. Ford grabbed him by the collar and hauled him upright. Come on. We've got about 30 seconds before it gets smart and cuts us off. The shadow thing shrieked, a sound that bypassed Arthur's ears and drilled directly into his brain. He stumbled after Ford, the creature's amorphous limbs slapping against the walls behind them. They burst into a large chamber that defied all laws of geometry. The walls stretched into infinity, curving at impossible angles. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it floated a shimmering object that seemed to shift between forms. A book, a sphere, a cube, a spiral. Arthur's eyes hurt just looking at it. There it is, Ford said, pointing dramatically. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Abyss, the single most unsettling book in existence. It's the reason I came to Earth in the first place. Well, that and the drinks. Arthur doubled over, panting. You dragged me into this nightmare. For a book? Ford nodded. A very special book. It's not just a guide. It's a key. And not just any key. A key to the silent realms. Arthur stared at him, incredulous. Do you even hear yourself? The silent realms? What does that even mean? Ford didn't answer. He was already climbing the steps to the pedestal. The shadow thing spilled into the chamber, its amorphous form expanding to fill the space. It roared, the sound reverberating through Arthur's bones. Ford! Arthur yelled. Whatever you're doing, do it faster. Ford reached for the guide. The moment his hand touched it, the room exploded with light. The creature howled, shrinking back as beams of shimmering energy shot out in every direction. Arthur shielded his eyes, the light too intense to bear. When the light faded, the chamber was still. Arthur blinked, his vision swimming. Ford stood on the pedestal, holding the guide, which had settled into the form of a book with a pulsating, iridescent cover. Well, Ford said, flipping it open. That was easier than expected. The creature hissed, shrinking into a smaller, more defined shape, a humanoid figure made of liquid shadow. It stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixed on the guide. Arthur backed away, his heart pounding. What is it doing? Ford glanced at the creature, then at the guide. Oh, it's bound to the book. You see, the guide isn't just a compendium of horrors, it's also a prison. This poor sod must have gotten trapped in it centuries ago. Poor sod? It just tried to kill us. Ford shrugged. Prison's not a happy place. Can't blame it for being a bit cranky. The creature spoke then, its voice a low, guttural rasp. Release me. Arthur shivered. Don't listen to it, Ford. Ford tilted his head, considering. What do you think, Arthur? Should we set it free? Arthur's jaw dropped. Are you insane? Possibly. Ford grinned and snapped the book shut. The creature snarled and dissolved into a fine mist, which was promptly sucked into the guide's cover. There, Ford said cheerfully. All sorted. Arthur gaped at him. You just, what have you done? I've ensured we don't die horribly, Ford said. Well, for now, anyway. Come on. We've got to get to the bridge before the ship decides it's hungry again. As they made their way through the labyrinthine corridors, the ship began to change. The walls, once faintly glowing and organic, now pulsed with a deep crimson light. The hum that had plagued Arthur since the start of this nightmare grew louder, shifting into an eerie, mournful wail. The ship doesn't like what we did, Ford said casually. Arthur shot him a look. You mean the part where you stole its magical, soul-trapping book? Ford grinned. Exactly. The wail grew louder, punctuated by the sound of metal grinding against metal. The walls trembled, and the floor buckled beneath their feet. Run! Ford shouted, grabbing Arthur's arm. They sprinted down the corridor as the ship seemed to fold in on itself. Rooms collapsed into one another, doorways vanished, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. Arthur stumbled, his lungs burning. Where are we even going? To the bridge. Ford yelled. It's the only way out. The bridge of what? A nightmare? Ford didn't answer. He skidded to a stop in front of a massive, circular door etched with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. This is it, he said, slapping his hand against a panel beside the door. The door groaned open, revealing a chamber filled with an assortment of incomprehensible controls and displays. At the center of the room was a throne-like chair made of twisted metal and bone. Arthur hesitated. What is this place? The bridge, Ford said, striding toward the chair. And also the ship's brain. It's where we negotiate our exit. Negotiate? Arthur repeated, his voice rising. Ford sat in the chair, his expression grim. Or die trying. Ford sat back in the grotesque throne, his fingers tracing the jagged, bone-like controls. The bridge, if it could even be called that, pulsed with a malign intelligence. Veins of glowing liquid writhed beneath the floor, converging into the chair where Ford now sat. The air vibrated with a low, malevolent hum that Arthur had grown all too familiar with. Arthur lingered near the door, his stomach churning. The walls seemed to watch him, their organic patterns shifting in response to his presence. Ford, this is a terrible idea, Arthur said, his voice shaky. This whole thing is a terrible idea. What are you even trying to do? Ford didn't look up. His eyes had taken on a distant, glassy quality, as though he were staring into an abyss only he could see. I'm establishing rapport, he murmured. Rapport? With what? The ship? Yes, Ford said, his voice distant. The ship is alive, Arthur. It's been alive for a very long time. And right now, it's very, very angry. The walls shuddered violently, and Arthur stumbled. A chorus of faint whispers filled the room, speaking in a language Arthur couldn't understand but somehow felt. The words crawled under his skin, cold and slick, like worms burrowing into his mind. I don't think it wants to negotiate, Arthur muttered, clutching his head. Ford didn't respond. His fingers danced over the controls, his movements growing more frantic. The whispers grew louder, and the room darkened, the crimson light replaced by a deep, otherworldly blackness that seemed to devour the air itself. Then the voice came. It wasn't like the whispers. It was vast and resonant, a sound that seemed to emerge from the very fabric of reality. It spoke directly into their minds, bypassing their ears entirely. Why have you come? Arthur dropped to his knees, his thoughts unraveling under the weight of the voice. Ford, somehow, remained seated, though his face was pale and drenched in sweat. We seek passage, Ford said, his voice trembling. The ship laughed. It was a horrible, guttural sound, like the grinding of 1,000 teeth. You seek what you cannot have. Ford gritted his teeth. We have the guide. We can give it back, but only if you let us leave. The ship paused, its presence pressing down on them like a physical weight. When it spoke again, its tone was colder, sharper. You dare to bargain with me? Foolish creatures, you cannot fathom what you hold. Ford's hands tightened around the controls. I understand perfectly well what we hold. And I understand what happens if it gets into the wrong hands. You think I don't know what you are? What you were made to be? Arthur stared at Ford, his heart pounding. What is he talking about? The ship roared, and the walls convulsed violently. Ford was thrown from the chair, landing hard on the floor. You know nothing. Arthur crawled to Ford, who was groaning and clutching his side. What was that? What did you mean? What is this thing? Ford sat up, wincing. The ship isn't just a ship. It's a weapon, a relic of some long-forgotten war. Its purpose was to consume, to erase civilizations, devour their histories, their futures. It was designed to destroy, Arthur. But it was left behind, abandoned, and now, it's just hungry. Arthur's mouth went dry. You brought me onto a sentient, soul-eating murder machine? Ford managed a weak smile. Well, when you put it like that. The ship roared again, its anger palpable. The walls began to close in, the room shrinking as though the ship itself was trying to crush them. Great, Arthur muttered. We're going to be digested by a homicidal spaceship. This is exactly how I imagine my day going. Ford scrambled to his feet, pulling Arthur up with him. Not if we get to the emergency escape systems first. Arthur blinked. There are escape systems? Why didn't you mention that before? Ford shrugged. I didn't think we'd need them. Now, come on. They ran through the twisting corridors, the walls writhing and shifting as though the ship were alive. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their incomprehensible words echoing in Arthur's mind. Ford, Arthur said, his voice shaking, I don't think we're going to make it. Ford didn't answer. He was focused on the device strapped to his wrist, a grotesque amalgamation of wires and glowing, organic matter. This way, he shouted, veering left. Arthur followed, his lungs burning. Behind them, the corridor collapsed into a seething mass of shadow and light, the ship's wrath manifesting in physical form. They burst into a circular chamber lined with strange, pod-like structures. Each pod pulsed faintly, their surfaces covered in alien runes that seemed to shift and writhe when Arthur looked at them. Ford ran to the nearest pod and began pressing symbols on its surface. Get in. Arthur hesitated, eyeing the pod warily. Are you sure this is safe? Ford laughed, a sound tinged with hysteria. Of course not, but it's better than staying here, isn't it? Arthur glanced over his shoulder. The darkness was closing in, the whispers now a deafening roar. He didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, he climbed into the pod. The interior was cramped and claustrophobic, the walls covered in the same shifting runes. Ford jumped into the pod next to his and slammed his fist against the controls. The pod sealed with a hiss, and Arthur felt a sudden lurch as they were ejected into the void. Arthur felt his stomach drop as the pod accelerated, hurtling through the void at a speed that defied comprehension. The runes lining the pod's interior pulsed rhythmically, casting flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist into grotesque shapes. Through the pod's small viewport, Arthur caught glimpses of the ship they had escaped. A monstrous, biomechanical leviathan coiled in on itself like a wounded predator. Its outer surface was alive, writhing with tendrils of dark energy that lashed at the surrounding space. For a moment, Arthur felt a pang of guilt. The ship wasn't just alive, it was suffering. But that moment was fleeting. It had tried to kill them, and he wasn't about to mourn its pain. Ford's voice crackled through the pod's comm system, his tone maddeningly cheerful. Well, that was close. I'd say we've got about a 50-50 chance of survival now. Not bad, all things considered. Arthur fumbled with the comm panel. 50-50? That's supposed to be reassuring? What's the other 50%? Instant death? Instant? Oh, no. No. Much worse than that. But hey, Optimism. Arthur was about to scream at him when the pod shuddered violently. The viewport filled with blinding light, and then, nothing. Arthur woke to silence. The pod's walls were dark and cold, the glowing runes now extinguished. He pushed against the door, which opened with an ominous groan. He stumbled out into nothing. The space around him was empty, yet not in the way of a void or vacuum. It was a suffocating absence, a realm devoid of light, sound, or form. The ground beneath his feet wasn't solid. It was more like a suggestion, a vague pressure that kept him from falling into the endless abyss surrounding him. "Ford," Arthur called, his voice echoing strangely, as though the space around him were trying to swallow the sound. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. He spun around, but there was nothing there. "Ford!" he yelled again, panic rising in his chest. A figure emerged from the void, but it wasn't Ford. It was tall and skeletal, its skin stretched taut over its bones. Its face was blank, featureless, yet Arthur could feel it watching him. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. What are you?" The figure tilted its head, as if pondering the question. When it spoke, its voice was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I am the archivist," it said, "keeper of the Silent Realms." Arthur swallowed hard. The Silent Realms? What is this place? The archivist stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. "This is the space between realities, a place where time and form dissolve. Few who enter ever leave." Arthur's heart sank. "What do you mean, few? You're saying it's possible?" The archivist was silent for a moment, its head tilting again. "Possible, yes. Likely? No." "Great," Arthur muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Just fantastic. And what about Ford? The other guy? Did he make it here?" The archivist turned its blank face toward the void. "He is near. But this realm twists all who enter. Perhaps he will find you. Perhaps he will not." Arthur shivered. "That's not comforting." The archivist gestured, and a faint glow appeared in the distance. A winding path of pale light suspended in the void. "Follow the path," it said. "At its end, you may find what you seek. Or perhaps what seeks you." Arthur hesitated. "What does that mean? What's at the end of the path?" The archivist didn't answer. It simply faded into the void, leaving Arthur alone. He took a deep breath. There was no other choice. He stepped onto the glowing path, its surface cold and unyielding beneath his feet. The void seemed to close in around him as he walked, the silence oppressive. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, shapes that were almost familiar but never fully formed. The path twisted and turned, defying logic. At times, it looped back on itself, and Arthur had to resist the urge to look down. There was no ground beneath him, only the infinite darkness. After what felt like hours, he saw a figure ahead. Relief surged through him as he recognized Ford's unmistakable silhouette. "Ford," Arthur called, breaking into a run. Ford turned, his face pale and drawn. He looked wrong. His eyes were too wide, his smile too sharp. "Arthur, glad you made it." Ford's voice was light, but there was something unsettling about it. Arthur slowed, his relief replaced by unease. "Ford, are you okay?" Ford's smile widened. "Oh, never better. This place, Arthur, it's incredible. Infinite possibilities. Infinite horrors. Don't you feel it?" Arthur backed away. "What are you talking about? What happened to you?" Ford's expression darkened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "It sees us, Arthur. It's always seen us." Before Arthur could respond, the shadows around them surged forward, swallowing the path and everything on it. Arthur opened his eyes, or at least, he thought he did. There was no way to tell in the unrelenting darkness. His body felt weightless, untethered from any sense of direction or time. His skin prickled as if unseen eyes bore into him from all angles. "Ford," he called, his voice swallowed by the silence. No response came, but then, faintly, a voice whispered, "Arthur." He froze. It was Ford's voice, or was it? There was something wrong with it, something stretched and distorted, like a recording played backward. "Ford?" Where are you? The voice came again, closer now. Follow the sound. Arthur stumbled forward, his hands outstretched, searching for anything solid. The darkness around him shifted, and a faint, pulsing glow appeared in the distance. It wasn't a comforting light. It flickered erratically, its color an unnatural mix of green and violet, casting twisted shadows that moved even when Arthur stood still. Against every ounce of his better judgment, he moved toward the glow. The light led him to a vast expanse, an impossible space that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. In the center stood a grotesque monument, a massive obelisk of writhing flesh and metal, pulsating like a diseased heart. It emitted the strange, flickering light, and the closer Arthur got, the louder the whispers became. At the base of the obelisk stood Ford, or at least, what was left of him. Ford's body was still intact, but his eyes glowed with the same sickly light as the monument. His movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. "Arthur," he said, his voice hollow and reverberating, "you shouldn't have come here." Arthur's blood ran cold. "Ford, what happened to you? What is this place?" Ford tilted his head, his movements unnervingly slow. "This place, it changes you. It finds the cracks in your mind and fills them with itself. I tried to resist, but it's too vast, too old." Arthur took a step back, his heart pounding. "We need to get out of here. Come with me. We can find a way back." Ford laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the void. "Back? There is no back, Arthur. There's only forward." He gestured toward the obelisk. "It's waiting for you. It's been waiting for a very long time." Arthur shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "No, I'm not going near that thing." Ford's expression twisted into something alien, his glowing eyes narrowing. "You don't have a choice." Before Arthur could react, the ground beneath him shifted. Tendrils of black and silver erupted from the void, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the obelisk. He struggled, clawing at the ground, but there was nothing to hold on to, just the endless void. "Ford, help me!" he screamed. But Ford only watched, his expression unreadable. The tendrils dragged Arthur closer to the monument. As he neared it, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The light from the obelisk burned his eyes, but he couldn't look away. When he was only feet away, the tendrils lifted him upright, holding him in place before the pulsating mass. A new voice spoke then, deep and resonant, vibrating through his very bones. "You have been chosen." Arthur's mind reeled. "Chosen? For what?" The voice ignored his question. "Your kind calls me the void, but I am more than emptiness. I am all that is forgotten, all that was cast out." Arthur struggled against the tendrils. "I don't care what you are. Let me go." The void chuckled, a sound that made Arthur's teeth ache. "You carry the guide. It belongs to me." Arthur froze. "The guide? What do you mean?" "Ford has it." "No," the void said, its tone colder now. "It is with you. It has always been with you." Arthur's chest burned, and he doubled over in pain. A strange light began to emanate from his body, and he realized, to his horror, that the light was coming from within him. The tendrils lowered Arthur to the ground, but he couldn't stand. He clutched his chest, his vision swimming as the light grew brighter. Images flashed through his mind, fragments of memories he didn't recognize. A field of stars, an ancient city carved from obsidian, a hand reaching toward him from the depths of an ocean made of light. The void spoke again. "The guide is not a book. It is a piece of me, a piece of the void, scattered across reality to keep me whole. You are its host." Arthur's mind struggled to process the words. That's impossible. I'm just a man. I'm nobody." The void laughed again. "You were chosen long before you were born. The guide has been waiting for you." Ford stepped forward, his glowing eyes fixed on Arthur. "This is why I brought you here, Arthur. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd never come willingly. But you're the only one who can stop it." Arthur stared at him, his voice shaking. "Stop it? Stop what?" Ford gestured toward the obelisk. The void is waking. If it fully manifests in our reality, it will consume everything. You have the power to seal it away, but only if you accept what you are. Arthur shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't understand. I don't know how. Ford knelt beside him, his expression softening. You don't have to understand, Arthur. You just have to trust yourself. The void roared, its voice shaking the entire realm. Choose, mortal. Accept your destiny, or be destroyed. Arthur closed his eyes, the light within him growing brighter. Arthur's chest felt like it was on fire. The light within him surged, pulsing in time with the void's resonant, otherworldly voice. Memories, alien, fragmented, and incomprehensible, flooded his mind in a torrent. He saw himself standing on worlds that defied logic, surrounded by beings whose forms he could barely comprehend. He saw destruction, creation, and the infinite void in between. Arthur. Ford's voice cut through the chaos. Focus. Don't let it take over. Arthur's hands clawed at the ground as he fought to control the storm raging inside him. I don't know how, he screamed, his voice cracking. Ford knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. His glowing eyes burned with an intensity that was both comforting and terrifying. You have the guide, Arthur. It's not just a book or a key. It's a part of you. Trust it. Trust yourself. The void's voice boomed, shaking the very fabric of the silent realms. Enough. You cannot resist me. Accept your purpose or be erased. Arthur's vision blurred. The obelisk loomed before him, its pulsating light drawing him closer. The tendrils tightened around his body, pulling him toward the monument of flesh and metal. The voices in his head screamed, their alien language clawing at his sanity. And then, amidst the chaos, Arthur felt something shift. The light within Arthur exploded outward, flooding the chamber with a brilliance so pure. It seemed to push back the darkness. The tendrils writhed and recoiled, their grip on him loosening. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound, deafening silence. Arthur's mind cleared, and for the first time, he felt whole. The guide, whatever it truly was, had fused with him completely. He could feel its presence, a vast reservoir of knowledge and power waiting for him to unlock it. He stood, the glow radiating from his body steady and unwavering. The obelisk trembled, its pulsating rhythm faltering. Ford stepped back, his expression a mixture of awe and relief. You're doing it, Arthur. You're controlling it. Arthur turned to face the void, his voice steady despite the fear still gnawing at the edges of his mind. You said I was chosen, that I was a host. But I'm not just your vessel. I'm something more, aren't I? The void growled, its voice no longer as commanding as before. You are nothing but a tool, a piece of the whole. You exist because I allow it. Arthur shook his head. No, I'm not just a piece of you. I'm the counterbalance. That's why the guide was hidden, why it waited for me. It's not your prison. It's your equal. The void roared in fury, its form shifting and twisting as it tried to reassert its dominance. Shadows surged toward Arthur, but they dissolved as they touched the light emanating from him. Ford clapped his hands together, grinning. Well, look at that. Arthur Dent, destroyer of cosmic nightmares. Who would have thought? Arthur felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The void was weakening, its power diminishing with every passing second. But even as it faltered, its presence was still overwhelming, its hunger an endless abyss. He turned to Ford. What happens if I seal it away? Will it ever come back? Ford's grin faltered. That's the thing about things like this. They don't ever really go away. You can lock it up, bury it in the deepest corners of existence, but eventually, someone or something will try to find it. That's just how these stories go. Arthur frowned. And if I destroy it? Ford's expression darkened. Destroying it could collapse the silent realms and everything connected to it, which is, well, everything. Arthur stared at the obelisk, his mind racing. He could feel the void's essence, its vastness, its insatiable need to consume. But he could also feel the guide, its power coursing through him, waiting for his command. Then there's only one option, Arthur said quietly. Ford raised an eyebrow. Oh, this should be good. What's the plan, fearless leader? Arthur took a deep breath. I'm not going to seal it away. I'm not going to destroy it. I'm going to absorb it. Ford's eyes widened. Arthur, that's completely insane. You don't know what that'll do to you. I don't care, Arthur said, his voice firm. If I'm its counterbalance, then I can contain it. I can keep it from hurting anyone else. The void's laughter echoed through the chamber. Foolish mortal, you cannot contain me. You will be consumed. Arthur stepped forward, the light from his body growing brighter. Maybe, but at least I'll take you with me. Arthur reached out, his hands glowing with an intensity that rivaled the void itself. The obelisk shuddered as he touched it, its surface writhing under his fingers. The light from his body clashed with the darkness of the void, the two forces colliding in a blinding explosion of energy. The silent realms trembled, their infinite expanse folding in on itself. Arthur felt the void's essence pouring into him, a torrent of darkness and chaos that threatened to tear him apart. But the guide was there, anchoring him, guiding him. He focused on its presence, using it to channel the void's power, to contain it. The obelisk disintegrated, its form dissolving into the void. The tendrils, the whispers, the shadows, all of it flowed into Arthur, merging with the light that radiated from him. When it was over, the silent realms were still. Arthur stood alone, his body glowing faintly. He could feel the void within him, a heavy, suffocating presence that would never fully leave. But he was still himself. For now, become. The void writhed within him, its presence a ceaseless murmur in the back of his mind. It clawed at his thoughts, a relentless tide of chaos and hunger, but the guide's light held it at bay. He could feel the silent realms shifting around him. Where there had once been an endless void, there were now shapes, faint echoes of places and people long forgotten. A forest of crystalline trees shimmered in the distance, their branches singing a mournful tune. Above him, stars blinked into existence, only to fade moments later. Ford appeared beside him, his face drawn and pale. Well, you're still alive. That's a good start. Arthur managed a weak smile. Alive, sure. But this thing, it's never going away, is it? Ford shook his head. Probably not. But hey, you've got the guide. That's got to count for something, right? A cosmic flashlight to keep the boogeyman in check. Arthur sighed. It's not just a flashlight, Ford. It's part of me now. I don't even know where I end and it begins. Ford placed a hand on his shoulder. You're still you, Arthur. The fact that you're worrying about it proves that. Now come on. We've got to find a way out of this place before it collapses completely. Arthur glanced around at the silent realms, which seemed to be unraveling at the edges. And if we can't? Ford grinned. Then at least we'll have front-row seats to the end of everything. As they made their way through the shifting landscape, Arthur began to notice strange patterns in the chaos. The echoes of places and people grew more distinct, their forms coalescing into fleeting glimpses of other realities. He saw a version of Earth where the sky was a perpetual storm and humanity lived in massive floating cities. He saw himself sitting in a cafe on a moon made of glass, sipping tea with a creature that looked like a sentient cloud. He saw Ford standing atop a mountain of bones, laughing as 1,000 suns exploded in the sky above him. These aren't memories, Arthur said, his voice filled with awe. They're possibilities. Ford nodded. The silent realms are a nexus of what could have been and what might yet be. Every choice, every moment, leaves a mark here. It's why it's so dangerous. Spend too long in this place, and you might lose track of which reality is yours. Arthur frowned. Isn't that what happened to you? Ford smirked. I prefer to think of it as expanding my horizons. They eventually came to the edge of the silent realms, where the chaos gave way to a vast, swirling vortex of light and shadow. Arthur could feel its pull, a force that seemed to resonate with the power inside him. This is it, Ford said. The only way out. Arthur hesitated. What happens if I go through? Ford shrugged. Best case scenario? You end up back in your reality, more or less intact. Worst case? You scatter across the multiverse like a particularly stubborn stain. Arthur laughed, a hollow sound. Comforting. Ford clapped him on the back. Hey, you've made it this far. What's a little more existential risk? Arthur took a deep breath and stepped into the vortex. Arthur opened his eyes to find himself standing on Earth, or at least, something very much like it. The sky was blue, the grass was green, and the air smelled faintly of rain. For a moment, he dared to hope that he was home. But the cracks were there, if you knew where to look. The clouds moved in strange patterns, and the shadows cast by the trees didn't quite match the sunlight. It was as though the world had been hastily reconstructed from memory, with the details slightly off. He felt the void stir within him, restless and hungry. The guide pulsed in response, its light steady and unwavering. Ford appeared beside him, looking oddly serene. Well, what do you think? Not bad for a patched-up reality. Arthur turned to him. What do you mean? Is this my Earth? Ford shrugged. Close enough. The Silent Realms took what you gave them and built this place. A fresh start, of sorts. Arthur frowned. And the void? Ford's expression grew serious. That's the thing about the void. It's part of you now. It always will be. But as long as you keep it in check, it won't consume this world. Arthur nodded slowly. And if I don't? Ford smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. Then we'll have to do this all over again. But hey, no pressure. Arthur stood on a hill overlooking the reconstructed world, the weight of his new existence pressing down on him. He was no longer just a man. He was a guardian, a vessel for both creation and destruction. The guide pulsed in his mind, its presence a comforting beacon in the darkness. He knew he would never be free of the void, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Ford sat beside him, gazing up at the sky. So, what's next, Arthur? Going to save the universe? Rebuild civilization? Or maybe just have a nice cup of tea? Arthur smiled faintly. Maybe all three. But first, I think I'll just sit here for a while. And so, Arthur Dent, the reluctant hero, the vessel of light and shadow, sat and watched the world he had helped create, knowing that his journey was far from over. But for now, at least, he had found peace.